Chapter 14. Ava leaned against the brown Formica counter and stared into her empty mug as her thoughts swirled around in her head. "Oh, there you are. I thought you were just getting a drink, but when you didn't come back for 10 minutes, I began to wonder." Genevieve stood in the doorway of the little office kitchen. It wasn't really much of a kitchen, but as it contained a small fridge, an even smaller stovetop, and 2 cabinets that held plates and silverware, Ava classified it as a kitchen. It didn't, however, have the room for a table and chairs, which was why she leaned against the counter currently. She pointed to the simple black kettle next to her that sat on the stovetop. "It hasn't whistled yet." In fact, it took ages for the burner to heat up the kettle. Ava probably could have walked to the nearby coffee shop and ordered a tea faster than her water would heat up, but she hadn't wanted to. She wasn't even sure she wanted tea as much as she wanted the quiet stillness waiting for the water to boil brought. Her computer wasn't in here mocking her, and so she could let her mind wander to the thoughts that consumed it anyway. Genevieve's brow arched slightly, and she crossed her arms as she leaned into the doorframe. "Uh-huh. Well, you guys looked good on the show last night. Very believable." Ava nodded, but her mind wasn't on the show. It was still firmly fixated on the conversation she'd had with Justin after the show, the one where he turned his back on his estranged brother, and of course, how she could fix it. Ava understood sibling rivalry. Her sister had been the pretty one, the one who always won prom queen and homecoming queen and pickle queen, a crown title reserved for girls who lived in Piedmont, her hometown, though Ava wasn't sure Kelsey had been quite as excited about that one. And her brother Tristan, he'd been the brains of the family, the one who'd attended medical school and now headed the trauma unit at one of the biggest hospitals in the state. And she'd been the dreamer, the one who escaped into books and writing, the one who created characters and plots who found their happily ever afters because she couldn't seem to find hers in real life. But even though she and her siblings were different, she'd never turn her back on them if they needed bone marrow. Of course, they hadn't stolen her husband either. Not that she had one. Still, she needed to find a way to get Justin to give his brother a chance to apologize. "Uh-oh, I know that look. What's going on?" Genevieve crossed to the cupboard and retrieved a mug for herself, but she didn't wait for the piercing whistle of the kettle. She turned instead to the Keurig machine and popped a pot in. "You know this makes tea, too, and it's faster than your kettle method," she said as the machine began its familiar warm-up groans and gruntings. Ava shrugged. "It's not the same." The kettle elicited its shrill cry at that moment, and she turned the burner off, dropped a tea bag in the mug, and poured in the water. Then she picked up the mug and cradled it in her hands, enjoying the warmth emanating from the ceramic sides. "It's Justin. He got a call from his sister last night. It seems his brother needs a bone marrow transplant and wants to know if he's compatible, but he refuses to even get tested." "What?" Jen picked up her mug, blew lightly on the brew, and then braved a sip. "Why?" Ava sighed and shook her head. Evidently, his brother is the Botox doctor his second wife ran off with. Genevieve let out a low whistle. "Whoa. That's pretty heavy." "Yeah." Ava bit the inside of her lip and watched the amber liquid swirl in her cup. "They haven't spoken in years, but I feel like they need to. Like maybe forgiving his brother will help Justin move past his anger and his hatred of romance." Jen's eyebrow arched. "Are you hoping they'll reconnect for his sake or for yours?" "What?" Ava pushed herself off the counter and headed back toward the main office, making sure to keep her eyes on her drink and away from Genevieve's prying gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, yes, you do. You're developing feelings for this guy, aren't you?" Ava set her mug down at her scratched and scarred desk. It had been a hand-me-down from her father when he upgraded his office equipment, but Ava loved it. She held fond memories of writing at this desk while her father spoke with clients in the other room. Her initials were still engraved on the side, though he had been peeved the day she had done that. She pulled out the ergonomic chair, that she had splurged on, and sat down. "No, of course not. It would never work out. He doesn't even attend church, and you know a relationship with God is important to me." Ava glanced up, but Genevieve had her head cocked in the, I don't believe you expression that she used whenever she thought Ava was lying. "And if he did?" Ava sighed. "Okay, I don't know. I mean, I know I shouldn't be attracted to him for all the reasons I just gave, but..." Ava shrugged as she let the statement trail off. She had spent last night dissecting the dilemma. She wanted to believe her desire to help Justin was altruistic and had nothing to do with her, but the truth was she did feel something for him. She just wasn't sure if it was friendship or something more. Genevieve sat down at her desk across the room. "Well, I think you better figure that out before you go in trying to Dr. Phil things you may not understand." Ava's breath exited in a small sigh as she turned back to her screen. Jen was right, of course. She was the more rational one. Ava tended to leap first and ask questions later, and on more than one occasion, that had landed her in hot water. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling she was supposed to do something, especially after the weird way they met in the first place. Justin punched the ignore button and pocketed his cell phone as he stepped into the office he and Peter shared. Garrett had been calling all morning, but Justin had nothing to say to him. Not now, not ever. Peter looked up from his computer as Justin entered. "I watched the show last night. She's good." Justin sat down and punched the button to turn his laptop on. A tiny hum filled the room and the screen blinked to life. "Yeah, she is, but that was just one show. And Kevin wasn't entirely convinced. It's going to take more than that to turn the image around." "It may not take as long as you think. Check the headlines." Justin pulled up a browser and clicked into the URL bar. He typed the evening show and hit enter. The screen blinked, and then a picture of Ava and him smiling at the camera filled the screen. Underneath was a short article with a bold heading. "Has the Grinch found his mate?" he read aloud. His eyes flicked to Peter's. "I'm not sure that's exactly helping my image. They're still calling me the Grinch." "They are," Peter said with a wave of his hand. "But they're talking about the two of you, and they're not the only ones. The article ran on Star Weekly and Hollywood Today." "That's good." Justin's attention returned to his computer screen. He had loaded his email and now stared at one from Garrett. Did he read it? Delete it? "Good, huh? What's going on with you?" Justin looked up, sighed, and raked his hand across his chin. The stubble scraped like sandpaper across the palm of his hand. He didn't normally skip shaving, but last night he'd lain awake so long thinking about Candy and Garrett and Ava that he'd slept through his alarm. Another thing he rarely did. "Liz called last night." "Uh-oh." Justin nodded. He'd known Peter long enough that Peter knew his background, and that a call from his sister rarely proved a good thing. The relationship between his sister and him remained tentative at best. "Yeah, evidently Garrett is sick and needs a bone marrow transplant. They want me to get tested." Peter's chair groaned as he leaned back in it. They both agreed it was time for new furniture, but neither of them had made the first move to look for any more. Justin no longer knew if it was because neither of them liked shopping, or if they both held a fondness for the furniture that had been with them since the beginning of the journey. "And what do you want?" Now that was the question of the day. What did he want? He wanted to pretend Garrett didn't exist, but he couldn't really do that. Even though they were only half-brothers, they were still brothers. It was one thing to ignore him, but it was another thing entirely to let his brother die. Justin didn't even know if they were a match, but could he live with himself if they were and he did nothing to help? After all, he'd grown up taking care of Garrett. Justin had been 6 when his parents divorced, and he'd been 8 when Garrett was born. Though the age difference was significant, Justin had always wanted a brother, and he'd let Garrett join him in all the neighborhood games. It had been Justin, not his mother, who cleaned up Garrett's first skinned knee when he fell off his bike, and it had been Justin who iced his eye the time Garrett tried to catch a fly ball with his face. And honestly, the whole Candy thing wasn't even completely Garrett's fault. Justin had fallen prey to her charm as well, so he knew how convincing she could be. And Candy had been much younger than Justin. In fact, she was just a year older than Garrett. They'd probably had more in common. It didn't make what he did okay. Garrett should have put his foot down and turned away Candy's advances, but he hadn't. Still, though Justin didn't agree with what happened, he could see how it happened. I don't know. Ava says I should give him a chance to explain, but I don't know if I want to hear it. Another loud squeak filled the air as Peter leaned forward. You told Ava? She was with me when Liz called. I couldn't very well not tell her. But Justin knew what Peter was thinking. He had dated few people after Candy, and none of them knew about Garrett. The subject was off limits even to Peter most of the time. Are you falling for this girl? It was a simple question, and one Justin should have been able to answer no too quickly. But the truth was that he wasn't sure. The last 2 weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions, and his insides felt like they had been ripped out through his stomach and shoved back in through his mouth. Yet Ava had been there with him through all of it, and he liked the thought of her being around. And that thought scared him. No, he lied. This is just business. He cringed as he thought back to his harsh words to her the previous night. Besides, she's way too different from me. A believer. He shook his head. It would never work long term. Honestly, I'm surprised people are buying this relationship now. If I remember correctly, you were a believer once. Yes, once. Before God took Carol and then decided to twist the knife in further with Candy and Garrett. He's probably enjoying watching this predicament unfold. Somehow I doubt that, Peter said. He looked as if he wanted to push the issue further, but they'd had this discussion before. Anyway, finding love again wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But it would be, because in order to find love, he would have to open his heart again, and every time he had done that, it had been torn apart. No, he needed to take these feelings for Ava, whatever they were, and forget them. She was a means to an end, a new career, and that was it.